Sci Access, May 10, 2024. Why Disclosure Doesn't Work. Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to attempt screen share, which I do not have the ability to do, Caitlin.
I will fix that momentarily. There you go.
Okay, there we are. All right. So usually when I give these presentations, I introduce myself almost straight away after my first slide. So I'm just going to give you my first slide, which is entitled "Why Disclosure Doesn't Work," and subtitled "The 7 Barriers to Effective Accessibility Supports in the Workplace." The right-hand side of the slide shows a mocked-up book cover for a book that doesn't exist as yet, but I fundamentally believe that it's a book that needs writing, particularly in the context of accessibility in the sciences. So my name is Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai. I am the co-founder of an organization called Idea STEM, along with my colleague and partner, Ainsley Latour. On behalf of the two of us, I'm going to give this presentation with you today and formally introduce myself to you as a person who has been, I guess, empirically identified as the world's first congenitally blind geneticist. I'm currently the Vice President of Research and International Affairs and Chief Accessibility Officer for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, or CNIB. As I indicated, I'm a co-founder of Idea STEM, and it is in that capacity I'm speaking to you today. A number of other affiliations that I have. I'm co-chair for the External Advisory Committee on Accessibility and Systemic Ableism for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the chair for the Accessible Employment Technical Committee for Accessibility Standards Canada for the Federal Government of Canada, chair of the International Network of Visually Impaired Researchers and their allies, and anyone who wants to ask me about that can do so in the question period. I have a number of adjunct faculty appointments and a few other research leadership roles as well. I'm going to start this presentation with a quotation that I actually quite enjoy the quotation, not because I think it's overly metaphorically flowery or anything like that, but I enjoy it because of how badly society has actually bungled it, even despite our best efforts to achieve it. And so Microsoft is very fond of saying that accessibility should be built in, not bolted on. And I'm going to take you through this presentation and give you a modification of this quotation at the end of it, which I think tells a really meaningful story of why the situation around accessibility and disability in sciences is what it is today, and how badly this quotation has actually been implemented is the root cause of all of that. I'm going to start by giving you a brief history of how we do Western science, and this is a 600-year history in the space of 15 seconds. The scientific tradition today started with the naturalists of the 14 and 1500s, who were really trying to understand the world, understand the universe through a very religious lens, through the lens of understanding the hand of God. The naturalists became the Renaissance scientists, who became very much the lone scientist model of the 1600, 1700, 1800, where you found this one person who was doing the work, and this one person who was being talked about as related to the work. And it wasn't until the 20th century that we start talking about science teams. And at first we were talking about small science teams. But now in the 21st century, we really talk about large science teams. As a matter of course, science is a team activity. It's a team process today, which is really funny because when we learn how to do science, we learn how to do science in very much the lone scientist mode. We're taught how to do it that way. All the policies are built around the lone scientist. They're not built around team science. And the conversation around disability in science is the conversation around disability in the context of the lone scientist, not necessarily in the context of large science teams. The scientific research ecosystem is also quite diverse because, again, we concentrate on the person who does the science, but what about their colleagues, their supervisors, their collaborators? What about those people who give them funding? What about knowledge translation to peers or to the public? So there's so many other people who are involved in the science space, even as trainees, that we don't tend to think about. So similar to what I just did, let's do a short history of how we frame disability in the Western world, this time starting in the 1700s. And so in the 17 and 1800s, we called disabilities afflictions. Again, very religious overtones associated with that. Post-Darwin and the theory of evolution, we started to refer to handicaps, as in handicapped in the game of life, which very much was the societal conception of evolution, that life was a game. Somebody had to win it, somebody had to lose it, and if you were handicapped in the game of life, you were much less likely to win it. We started to use the word disability in the 1900s to replace handicap. It took a long time to get handicap out of the vocabulary. In many ways, it's still in the vocabulary, but we started to use disability. Disability is very pathological in nature by definition. Dis, Greek, not. Habile, Greek, able to do. So disability literally means not able to do. We also use the term special needs, particularly as it relates to children and education. In the late part of the 1900s, we started to come up with some really funky politically correct terms like different ability and lesser abled and diverse ability and diffability and all sorts of really interesting things that tried to get away from the overtly negative overtones of disability. But in getting away from those overtly negative overtones, what we were also doing was eliminating the memory of disability oppression. And so the disability community has thought to take back the word. In the future, one day maybe we'll get to other ways of thinking about disability, perhaps even other cultural norms of thinking about disability, where disability is not actually seen as a pathological condition, but rather seen as part of human phenotype variation, and in so doing not lose that memory of oppression. Disability in science gets conceptualized as a health outcome, but for almost all of us, it's a demographic identity, and there's a huge tension between those two things. Disability in society gets conceptualized through the lens of a monolithic experience, but all of us know that it is very personalized. The disability framework that exists today is I think pretty static, which is unfortunate because our lived experience is modified by all sorts of things. Our age of onset, the context of our lived experience is a temporary, permanent, episodic, situational, or progressive. The severity of our lived experience, the use of assistive technology, and the environment that we live in. We conceive of barriers today in the world as two types. One is intrinsic, so it's a person-centered barrier, and the other is extrinsic, it's a systemic barrier, and we don't actually tend to think of those two things as connected all the time. And we work through the barriers that we encounter in school and in work by sort of asking, well, what kind of barrier is it? How does it impact my participation? And then we try to ask for help, and we've got to figure out who to go to and how to ask. And then in theory, we're developing or co-developing a solution that is very personalized to me and the outcome that I need. Will this work for me is the question that always gets asked. But I want us to reconceive barriers in this conversation, and let's use the iceberg model. So on the screen is a cartoon image of an iceberg surrounded by lots and lots of freezing cold water, and really nice blue skies above the water. But the tip of the iceberg, the 10% that's above the water, that's the person-centered barrier. But underneath the surface of the water, you've got the 90% of the iceberg that's the systemic barrier. So it's really the person-centered barrier is just the projection of the systemic barrier through the surface of the water. So let's give some examples here. So let's translate the person-centered barrier. I cannot read the scientific paper or the meeting document or whatever. And the systemic barrier is that documents are routinely created in inaccessible formats. If the person-centered barrier is I need an oral or an ASL or a language interpreter, the systemic barrier is meetings are held in the dominant language. If the systemic barrier is I need help to load an agarose gel, the systemic barrier is one has to do an experiment unaided. If the personal-centered barrier is I need extra time on an exam, The systemic barrier is the length of time it takes to complete the task actually matters. If the person-centered barrier is the survey is not accessible to me, the systemic barrier is that surveys are constructed to be visually appealing and easily navigable with a mouse. If the systemic barrier is, if the person-centered barrier is, I cannot follow your presentation, Dr. Sukhai, the systemic barrier tends to be the presentations are often visually oriented, dense, and fast-paced. And if I'm going too fast for the interpreter, somebody please tell me. Underpinning the concept of both person-centered and systemic barriers is the concept of ableism. Ableism is defined as the centering of having ability in one's person's thinking, in a person's feelings, thinking, or behavior. Disableism is a different term, and it is the active marginalization of disability in one's feelings, thinking, and or behavior. So these two things are related, but they counterbalance one another. Disableism is much more overt. Ableism is much more covert in terms of discriminatory behavior. And I'm going to argue with you that science, by its whole conception, the way that we do science today, according to the Western tradition, is fundamentally ableist. There is a conception of what the work we have to do is. There's a conception of the required ability in order to do that work. There's a conception of the required skills or accomplishments needed to pass thresholds in a scientific career. And there's a conception by contradistinction of who doesn't have the ability or the accomplishments because they're not doing the work. You've got personal ableism, which is centered on the individual, which is expressed and reflected in overt and covert attitudes. There's a disconnect between feelings here and thoughts and behavior. And then there's systemic ableism, which is centered on policies, practices, and frameworks. In ableism, we make assumptions. We make assumptions about who belongs within a given space or how rules apply to a group of people. We make assumptions about use cases in every situation we think about, and these assumptions underpin how we develop policy, practice, guidance, and frameworks, but they're not likely to be conscious. Here's a truism for you. The system that we live in the context of science and in the context of disability, is actually not broken. It is, in fact, designed to be exclusive of persons with disabilities. Therefore, it cannot be broken if it's doing the very thing it's set up to do. So remember the freezing cold water I told you about that surrounded the iceberg? That's ableism. It feeds the iceberg. It sustains that iceberg. And so we can translate the barriers to the ableist assumptions. And so if I can't read the consent form, the ableist assumption is everyone has the same level of functional vision. If I need an interpreter, everyone uses the dominant language in the same way without assistance. If I need help to lose an agarose gel, everyone needs to have a basic level of fine motor skills to do molecular biology. If I need extra time on an exam, everyone processes information in the same way and at the same pace. If the survey is not accessible to me, everyone thinks visually and is able to use a mouse. And if I cannot follow your presentation, everyone processes information in the same way and at the same pace and has common understanding of language and terminology. Okay, so having chatted with you about ableism and about the underpinnings of ableism in science, let's talk about duty to accommodate, because we as persons with disabilities use the duty to accommodate process to actually be able to do science. Duty to accommodate comes from me, the student or worker or job applicant, having a duty to inform my educator or employer of a need for accessibility support. Educator or employer has a duty to inquire about that need and make sure that they do their due diligence on it, and then once they've received that information, pending their evaluation of that information, they have a duty to accommodate. There are these things called bona fide occupational requirements or bona fide academic requirements, which can sometimes be discriminatory against persons with disabilities. And you figure this out using something called the Mioran test. And these requirements, the BFORs and BFARs, they're really the essential requirements of a course or a program or a discipline or what have you. And they're the things that we kind of have to do. They're the things that we're required to do as people doing that thing, that job, that course or program of study. And if an educator and employer can legitimately argue in favor of a discriminatory requirement, which cannot be accommodated, then this term called undue hardship actually applies. Now, the thing is that we don't know how to argue about this as students or trainees or workers or applicants. On the other hand, people on the other side of the table, not necessarily our profs, not necessarily the people that we're working for, but the HR people and the disability services people, they know how to argue about this. And so if an accommodation request gets denied, one of the reasons it's used for denial is this, but this can actually often get completely misinterpreted. When people are balancing requests for accessibility supports, and I tend to prefer using accessibility supports to the word accommodation. When people are balancing accessibility supports and trying to figure out what to do, they're using a calculus of organizational risk versus benefit. The benefit is to the person, you, me, the student, the trainee, but it's really the organizational risk that takes precedence in that conversation. This whole process of duty to accommodate is triggered by the issue of disclosure. So we undertake disclosure, which is the practice of self-identifying as a person with a disability. It's considered to be synonymous with identifying an accessibility need. We'll call it self-identification sometimes. It's considered to be a component of self-advocacy, and it is required for accommodation supports in education and employment setting. So accommodation requires disclosure, meaning accommodation is a reactive process, not a proactive process. There's a need to ask for help. The human rights requirement embedded in all of this is disclosure of need for accessibility support. The problem is that that's assumed by the educator, the employer, and ourselves to mean medical or similar documentation of diagnosis or functional impact. And the problem is that those two things are not the same thing, and somebody actually has to translate between the two. So there's this tension between functional need and diagnosis in the disclosure. The fun thing is you don't actually always need to disclose. You don't need to disclose if somebody on the hiring team knows you. You don't need to disclose when you're using assistive technology and it's obvious that you're using assistive technology. You don't need to disclose when your web footprint discloses for you already, but most of us don't tend to think about that. So you actually have to recognize that even if you don't say anything, people will know things that you have told them on Facebook and Instagram and X and TikTok and so on. But you also, and this is the most important thing, you also don't need to disclose when you have no perceived need for accessibility support. So what's really wrong with disclosure? Technically nothing, but it's full of hidden assumptions and biases. Disclosure equals I ask for help. The hidden philosophy there is if you need help, it's okay to ask for it in practice. Why do you need help? This requirement to legitimize your disability is what comes back. Disclosure is I have to tell you about my disability. There's a legal requirement actually for accommodation need or accessibility need. In practice, diagnosis documentation is what gets requested. So the conversation becomes medicalized. And there's a really good reason for that, which we'll talk about in the question period if anyone's interested. Disclosure is putting the person with a disability in charge of the conversation. The intent is a person-centered approach. In practice, yes, you're at the center of the conversation, but you're not in charge of it. And in fact, all of the questions about, well, the why and the wherefore and explain this and why this and why not the other thing, that puts you on the spot because you're at the center of having to answer all of those questions. Disclosure is about making the need obvious. The principle here is a good one. Never assume the person with a disability knows themselves and their needs the best. That's true, except for two problems. One, accessibility supports can be denied or watered down due to a lack of understanding and/or consultation. And two, the interaction between you and your environment is what drives that accessibility support requirement. And that changes with your environment. And so what you might need in the lab isn't going to be what you might need in the classroom. And you won't know until you're in the environment what actually will work for you. And so when you try to have this conversation, before you get into a space, you don't really know how to answer questions. None of us do. So what ends up happening is we use the same words, but different meanings. Two conversations are happening at the same time. There's something wrong with accommodations as well, and that is they're transactional. And by that, I really mean that accessibility supports are negotiated between employer and employee, but the successful use of accessibility supports doesn't actually mean that we're going to be successful because of a few things. One, to do with this thing that I've called the interactional ecosystem. So we work with a bunch of people in school, in internships, in research programs, in jobs. We work with our manager, we work with teammates, peers, We worked with people who report to us. We work with internal collaborators, external collaborators, stakeholders. We work with customers or clients, and we work with the leadership. We also use a whole pile of things, especially in the sciences. We use all sorts of software, all sorts of tools, all sorts of technology that we are interacting with alongside our accessibility supports. And they may not talk to each other very well. In fact, usually they don't. And so this leads to the 7 barriers to accessibility supports in school and in the workplace. Lived experience with disability is not one size fits all. Policy and application don't always line up. I haven't talked about some of these, but we can talk about it in the question period. The person who came up with duty to accommodate probably never had to use it. Disclosure is person-centered. The requester is at the core of conversations, but also at the core of legitimization of their need. Disclosure and trust get conflated. Disclosure doesn't always work, and accommodations by themselves are insufficient. So this is my modification of Microsoft's quotation. As a society, we've become very good at building in how to bolt accessibility on, and we do it in a very reactive way, not a very proactive way. Part of the solution to this is we need to teach ourselves as students, workers, and job applicants how to navigate the system better. We need to understand in the world that exists how we should actually have the conversations that we need to have. First of all, we need to change the way we disclose. We shouldn't use ability first language, I can do the job with. We need to actually disclose functional need, because that gets us more street cred with the people we need to talk to. Disclosing when necessary and only when necessary is not lying. We need to fully commit to that. We need to understand it. We also need to understand that our disclosure is not us controlling the conversation. It's us giving control of the conversation to the other person. We need to read the room that we're in when we're disclosing, and we need to understand that Mioran test so we can have that conversation, because that's the reason that people are going to deny us accessibility supports. We also need to consider systemic solutions. We need to consider universal design applied to training and research environments, also clinical environments in the biomedical space. We need to identify and understand the essential requirements. We need to sponsor our trainees and professionals from equity deserving groups, including persons with disabilities. We need to reframe accommodations and the accommodation practice as the minimum, and we also need to reframe how we do it. We need to think very much about inclusive and equitable communication practices, and we need to think of ourselves as educators. I'm going to close with this slide, which is this notion of the 3 A's. In the world that we live in today, we're very much in the innermost circle of this nested Venn diagram, where we think about accommodation at work or at school as the way to be accessible. But there's a better way, and that is to have an accessible by design environment. And there's a best way, and that is to actually evolve to an anti-ableist environment, which encapsulates both accessibility by design and accommodations in the space. So I'm going to leave you with this question and contact information. Can we change how we do science and research? The IdeaSTEM website and email address is there, but also if you want to follow me on LinkedIn or contact me directly, you can, and our contact information is on the slide. I'm going to leave it there for 10 seconds and then stop the screen share, and Caitlin can tell me how much time we have for questions.
Thank you so much, Mahadeo. At this time, we're going to be moving to our Q&A. We have about 4 minutes for Q&A. So for those of you who have been in a Zoom webinar before, you know how this process works. But for those of you who may not have, at this time, you'll want to click on the Q&A icon, which will be either in the bottom bar or the top bar, depending on what device you are on. And you're able to then enter questions for Dr. Sukhai to respond to. And it looks like we have one from Samantha saying, how can we shift away from the conversation of lone scientists? I run a visibility project called STEM with Disabilities and worry that I am reinforcing the rhetoric by showcasing individual scientists.
So that's a really good question, Samantha. I'm aware of STEM with disabilities, and I think I would say you absolutely can showcase the individual scientists because they're role models, if they choose to be highlighted that way. But you want to highlight their stories in the environments that they're in. So it's not just about my accomplishments, it's about how that actually fits in the overall arc of the space that I've worked in. So my accomplishments as part of my team and how I've worked with my team need to be part of those stories, not just not just, hey, what did I do? Right. So I would really think about it that way. I would also say, and I've actually just conducted a hiring process for someone to join my team at CNIB. When we do job interviews, it's all about me. There's no I in team, right? But as somebody pointed out to me, there is an ME in team. It's just backward. And so when we think about how we sell ourselves, we're not selling ourselves as part of an environment. We're selling ourselves as ourselves. Thank you, Dale Carnegie. And we really need to get away from that.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Ashley saying, thank you for your talk. Excited to share your info with some of my friends in the accommodations world. How do we get accessibility services, i.e. services for students with disabilities, etc., to reorient or change how they approach this process?
Actually, that's a great question. And I'm really looking forward to your keynote if I'm actually able to attend it. You know what, that's fantastic, because not just how do you change accessibility services, but also how you change HR philosophies. I think what we have to do is we have to acknowledge that the only way to successfully and sustainably do that is to get at these folks as they're being trained. Because by the time that they're in the professional practice for 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, you almost can't change their minds. And the opportunity isn't there to really get them to reframe. I think they want to reframe, and they think that they are working toward accessibility by design, but the systems in which they operate, the funding that they get, the models that everything works under, promotes this other thing that we live in. And Ashley, I'll invite you to contact me afterward and we can talk more about it.
Thank you so much. One last question from Wendy. Can you share resources that advance our thinking on accessibility by design?
I think there's a lot of stuff that a few of us who work within this space have been evolving, and I would say, Wendy, again, reach out. Happy to pass some stuff along. Put you in touch with a few people. I will note before Caitlin cuts me off that I did note Jennifer's comment, and Jennifer's comment gets at what I was driving at when I answered Ashley's questions, because the whole system is built around a model that's about 100 years old, and nobody's questioned the model, including the professional societies. And so all the standards that exist reinforce this notion of duty to accommodate the way that it's set up, which is a fundamental barrier.
Sci Access. Learn more at www.sciaccess.org.